Hey guys, welcome back. Unversed podcast. Dan here. Today I'm with Shelby, and I thought we'd talk about a topic that is probably not mentioned a lot regarding like these kind of shows, superhero shows. And it brought up to me because last week's Arrow, episode 13, like the main plot of the story was just like, guys, anti-gun laws, gun control, let's get on this. And I'm not a big fan of that on these kind of shows, mainly because they're just a distraction for like the overall plot. And, you know, it's just something like sure, I get it. It's like, there's a quote that Curtis says in the episode, and he was just like, is this what our country has become? And I'm like, okay, I get what you're saying. Like, you're trying to make it with the times, but honestly, I'm like, this isn't something normal that would be brought up in Arrow, right? Because I'm thinking like, you guys are vigilantes. You guys, like, we've seen so many crazy things in Starling City, and to all of a sudden ask the mayor, like, well, what are your thoughts on gun control? Like, it just throws you off the show, I think. What do you think, Shelby?
Yeah, I really think this is an issue. Now, it is difficult to write fiction. Well, I guess really to do anything apolitically isn't easy, for sure. Like to have something that doesn't have a political point of view. It is difficult to do that, I guess, because everything that you do, every disposition that you have, and everything, like, even if it's not your opinion when you're crafting a character. Let's say you're crafting a character. Let's say you're not a right-winger and you're going to craft a right-wing character. Well, you're going to still do that based off of what you believe those people believe and why they believe those things, right? So there's, or whatever type of character you're going to create is going to be based off of dispositions and your understanding of those beliefs and projecting that onto the narrative that you're crafting. So, like, it's always going to happen one way or the other, right? But there's a big difference between going, what do I think this character is going to be like? Why do they act these ways? What sort of beliefs do they hold? And maybe how do those translate into actual policies? Because, of course, we all have different dispositions. Our dispositions on things and the policies that we agree with are not always 100% equal either. Like, I might have one certain disposition or set of beliefs, and then there's a certain policies that, like, I agree to, or that I like in certain candidates, but that doesn't mean I agree with everything in that policy even, and then vice versa. There might be some policies that I like, or I should say, like, just because I hold certain beliefs, you might be able to, like, infer certain policies or positions I would hold politically, but then that's not always true, and the reverse isn't always true. Like, oh, you're pro or anti-gun, therefore you must hold all these other beliefs, and you must believe because of this, this, and this. What I'm saying is, like, it's all more nuanced at the end of the day. And if you're really just genuinely trying to tell a story, try to tell a narrative, unless that is already a political narrative, then you really shouldn't have an issue. Like, if you're a good writer, you shouldn't have an issue telling that story and creating a narrative with real characters that isn't just blatantly going like, well, I believe in Prop 8. Well, I'm against abortion. Well, I'm for gun laws, or whatever it might be. You know, like, you wouldn't just, like, that's like telling instead of showing, right? With creating characters or creating a world. If, like, your character, it's kind of like in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., how I always hate that they always just talk about how cool May is, and May never really seems very cool, but they keep telling us that she's so cool, so I guess we're supposed to believe it, right? But no, because that's bad writing. We should see that she's a cool character, and they shouldn't have to tell us, frankly. We should just be like, oh, she's just some girl, right? She's just some whatever. She's just some person. And then she does something really cool, and then we're like, oh, okay, she's really cool. She's a really cool character. Likewise, if the show Arrow wants to illustrate that in this world, or maybe they're, even trying to say in all our world too, that there should be anti-gun laws, right? Then create a world that shows that guns are dangerous. Don't just tell us that guns are dangerous, because that's not really what they've done so far. I mean, I remember, it's not just that there's been several main characters that use guns as their primary weapons, but also Oliver at one point uses a gun in, I think it's season 2 or 3, and like John and Roy look at him and he's like, what? Well, I never said I didn't know how to use a gun. and and so like that just goes to show he's never been like an anti-gun person. That's not his character at all. He just uses the bow and arrow as his weapon of choice, and maybe for other reasons, but he's not actually anti-gun. I mean, he's killed a lot of people because like that's the only reason you would be anti-gun, right? Unless you're like got some weird esoteric, like you're against the gun manufacturing business or something. Like unless it's some weird thing like that, then the only reason you'd be against guns is because you're against killing people. But Oliver just killed somebody a few episodes ago, so we know that's not the case. But it just to end all that, like. Clearly, they're pushing a narrative here that they have to like shoehorn in this way of explicitly saying it, rather than a way that subtly makes you come to this belief. You know, it should be that you watch the show and you go like, you know what, I do think that like the guns are so bad in this universe or whatever. It's the same thing with vigilantes, really. Like, I don't think vigilantes should exist in real life at all. Like, I think that's a bad thing if we see people like that. Those people, in my opinion, are not good. Just like I think the Sokovia Accords should exist in real life, but the world that's set up by the MCU tells us otherwise. It informs us that in this universe, the one that we're watching on screen, my belief changes, and I go, well, no, the Sokovia Accords are wrong. So Captain America's right in his position against them, so that does a good job of the world just illustrating it for us. And the same thing generally with vigilantes, like Daredevil does a great job. Like I watch Daredevil and I'm like, yeah, vigilantes 100%, they need them here. They're that corrupt. It does a good job at setting the stage to tell that story. And Arrow's not that type of show. For at least not for this narrative, right, about the guns, and then to suddenly do that, I think is just really, really weak. And it's clearly like whatever this writer for this episode that wanted to do that, and the general disposition of people in the film industry to be against, to be left leaning, I guess is the thing, right? And then the comment about like, is this really what our country's come to? Which I guess is the comment really about Trump, which is just another thing. It's like, well, yeah, they're all going to be left leaning in the entertainment industry, pretty much. Like that's just the culture of it, and I mean I get that, but there's still a big difference between like you illustrate that world and you tell us blatantly that world. So.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's my rant.
Yeah, I mean, I think what they're trying to do, right? They're like, well, look at Arrow, right? It's the most grounded show in the DCEU, or DCCW, I should say. Mm. And it's like, well, we could really relate more to Arrow, right, than any of the other shows, because like this is the closest to what we have in reality, and it's just like, all right, let's try to put some real world situations in there, but like you said, like that's not how this world is set up. We got the League of Assassins, like 4 years in a row of terrorist acts in one city, right? And like their main concern is gun control and all this kind of stuff. Like, it's weird. Like, what I liked about Arrow and even on The Flash is, how they handled like Captain Singh and Mr. Fantastic, right, with their husbands. It was just a thing. Like, nobody made a big deal about it. It was just like, oh, that's just there. That's fine. Right, but if we go to a more extreme example, right, Legends of Tomorrow, where for the first half of season 2, it was all just like each episode's like we're either handling with like people who hate women in charge or lesbians, and then it's like, oh well, what about like black people and stuff, because they have Jax and they have Sarah, and it's like that's not what that show should be about. I mean, sure, like it made sense when Jonah Hex showed up and it's like, what, your captain's a lady? Right, but just ended there, and they had to bring it back full circle at the end of that episode. It's not something we need because we're not interested in that kind of stuff. We're interested in the characters and how they handle themselves, not like, oh, I'm gonna be bummed out because of the situation in this time period. Because, right, for Sarah and Jax, any time period they go, that's not the future, is the best for them.
Yeah, so, and that's another thing that's pretty important. So, as far as apolitical entertainment goes, like comic books, video games, these are things that have historically been apolitical. Like, yes, Captain America fights for America, but that's because it's an American comic, not because it's politically directed, right? Which should be really obvious to anybody who takes even a moment's glance at it, because Captain America, Steve Rogers, would obviously be on the right side of the political spectrum, and he would be a nationalist as well, and that's not reflected in really the storytelling outright at any point. And then it becomes obviously the opposite now in the past decade, when we've highly politicized the comic book industry, which is a side effect. The actual industry itself has become politicized with forced hiring quotas for either women or diversity, and that's then reflected in them being like, well, we have to tell the story of this person or that person, or of this race or that race, which the fact of the matter is it's not. Even if you are a minority, or if you're a woman, or if you're a woman, if you're a diverse minority, or if you're like a LGBTQ or whatever, like, and you are like, well, I really wish that there was comic book stories for me, whatever, like that I can read and relate to. Then one, you're fundamentally consuming comic books differently than we are. Okay, like fundamentally, the normal person, the average person who consumes comics, consumes them in an apolitical manner. They consume them like for the action, for the narrative, for the arc, for the art, not for political charge. You know, nobody is interested in reading, like, no one who's like a hardcore communist is going to be reading comic books to get their socks off. They're not going to do it. Like, that's not the outlet through which you would do that. It just doesn't exist. That's just not how it works. Now, if you are that person and you're like, man, I really wish I could read a comic book that was focused about being gay or something, well, then you're looking at you're looking at the comic book industry. You want to read that. It doesn't exist. So you have to make it, basically. Like when there's a vacuum for something that has a demand, then generally the market will actually create it, or like people step up to create it, and that's what should have happened. But that didn't happen. But instead, what happened was comic books died as an industry effectively, and in their like last grasp for trying to sell comic books, trying to make money, because that is what the industry is actually concerned with, which is my point, that they're not being nice. Like, they're not trying to appeal to you because you wish you had a comic book for you because you're a minority of some sort. What they're doing is trying to make you a part of their readership, because 20, 30 years ago, you looked at the comic book industry as one of those people and said, there is nothing for me here. Especially if what I want to consume is like strictly within the realm of my minority status, right? Like I want to consume something because of my whatever minority I fit into. It wasn't there, and there was never a strong enough demand to create it, and because it wasn't there, you didn't read comics, is my point. You were not part of their demographics in which like they sold comic books. And so since their demographics stopped reading comic books, their attempt has been to reach out to everyone else that isn't already reading comics by hiring other people like this and by creating stories like this. But I think it should be obvious that it's not working, because comic book sales could continually drop, and you, if it was a compelling story to tell the story of like these minorities the way that they want to tell them, the way that the Marvel as a company is trying to tell them, then it would have sold on its own. But instead, what they're trying to do is take let's take Captain America, let's take Iron Man, let's take whoever else, right, and just like inject into that character, right, rather than make their own character that's going to sell well. They take already established characters and try to say, well, if I take Iron Man, right, and take the people who already read Iron Man comics, then they're going to keep reading Iron Man comics. And then if I replace the Iron Man character, but still call it Iron Man with this minority group, then the minority group will read it. Plus, I'll have my other group. Not even that's happening, and it's hardly reaching beyond what's already, what like was already available. Like the same demographics are effectively reading comics, just a smaller amount. Like no new gay black people are reading stories about gay black people in Marvel. Like if those gay black people were interested in it, they already would have been reading it, is kind of what I'm saying. Like and all it's served to do is further alienate the actual audience. I think that point's coming full circle now. It was an apolitical industry. It was an apolitical art form. They politicized it, and it's caused an alienation for the actual people who want to consume apolitical content. Because if you're going to shove political content in their face and everywhere they look is political content, then it's not going to work out well for your industry because you're not a political industry. Does that make sense? Like if you want to read political content, you're just going to go to the source. Just like if you want to read comic books, you go to comic books. If you want to read action stories, you read action stories. You don't go to read an action story and they call it an action story. They sell it to you as an action story, and it's a romance story. You're going to be pissed off and you're not going to like it. And that's effectively what's happening here. You want to go for an apolitical story, you're getting a political story, and it alienates people. It's bad writing, frankly, like I was saying before, and it just serves nobody well, and ultimately it's only being done to make more money. Like there's no genuine heart behind it at all. And before I stop, so yeah, Jax and Sarah are like the chief offenders as characters in Legends as doing this, as always. Every time, they've got to shoehorn it in, and they've got to really push it up front. I'm a woman, and I'm capable. And the thing is, we already know. This series started with Arrow. And in Arrow, there was a character named Felicity that was a side character that was not intended to be a main character lasting for every season of the show. But because her character was such a likable character, because she was effectively capable at assisting the team, she became a real character, and everybody really liked her as long as she filled that role. And just in the same way that, like, when you politicize it, it gets worse. It gets less desirable. It's the same thing with Felicity. Like when they injected all this romance in her and made her into a different character. When they were telling us we were getting Felicity and we got something else, nobody liked it. No one liked Felicity. So it's the same concept. And again, like, no other woman in the series, in these series, has to assert that they are a woman and they're doing what they're doing, because we already know what they're doing. Because when we see them be capable, we're not stupid. I can see that Sarah's a woman. You don't have to tell me that Sarah is a woman, and I can see that she's capable because she will do capable things. But actually, the thing is like this season they've tried to be like, well, she's a captain, right? She's a captain and she's a woman. Well, she's not a good captain, actually. Like from what I will admit, I'm a couple episodes behind, but she's been not a good captain so far. So I do see that she's a woman, and I see that she's capable and a badass character, sure. But they just keep telling us that she's this captain, and wow, isn't that so unbelievable? And it's like, well, it's not actually unbelievable. You're just really trying to pretend like it is. And Wally is another thing I wanted to say. Wally never has to remind us that he's black. We know he's black. We don't need to make a big deal about it. It's cool that like it's cool, whatever. Like he's just a good character on his own without having to like force any sort of appeal to that factor.
No, yeah, I completely understand. In that Arrow episode, right, that bothered me with all, Curtis, right? Curtis is a black man. And he says in the episode to Renee, because Renee is like, well, yeah, people need guns, right? And that's an actual character and story plot for him, which I thought was good, but everything else wasn't. But yeah, anyways, Curtis says, he's like, I'm 3 times more likely to get shot than you are, Renee. I'm like, oh, Renee's totally on our side, right? Because he even said, he's like, look what we do. Like, of course. right? Like, we're vigilantes, we're this and that. Like, this is a dangerous city kind of thing. And, you know, like, the whole time before, like, this episode, like you said, Wally never has to tell us. Curtis never really told us. And even over on Supergirl, right? Like, James, like, we never get anything with his character, right? And, like, I get it. Like, oh, that's the theme of the episode, guys. We're trying to push this objective into your head. Like, oh, hey, actually, yeah, this episode really opened up to me about gun control, or about, like history and how, like, hateful it was towards blacks and women. And I'm like, that's not what we need for the show. That's not the purpose. And, you know, the best version, I think, that we've gotten so far was with Supergirl, because that actually kind of made sense with the story, with the whole, like, oh, alien immigration. Of course, it was around that time with the controversy of immigrants and stuff in the country. At least with Supergirl, they tried to make it part of the story and make it flow. And you know what? It kind of did. That's cool and all. You know, it wasn't a big distraction. I think that's what we really need. You know, like, going back to comics, I'm reading Totally Awesome Hulk. And that's with Amadeus Cho, right? An Asian man. He's now Hulk. Now, I think that does it the best in Marvel right now, because that's not what it's focused on. It's focused on this kid, right, who is having fun being the Hulk because he's the strongest out there and he's one of the smartest people, right? And Miss Marvel, right, I thought that was going to be a cool story, because it's just, oh, it's a fangirl of superheroes and now she has the powers to become one, right? That's cool and all, but then most of the story plot is just about her ethnicity and her culture and how that affects her. And it's like, oh, we need to understand this, and we need to, like, change our views about it and whatnot. Like you said, that's cool for the people who are going to read it for that, but I don't think that's what we need, right? Like you said, we don't need it in our comics, in our shows. I mean, sure, if Oliver for the past 4 seasons was just like, I'm never going to use a gun again, right, and would yell at John constantly about using guns, then this episode would make sense. But seeing as, like you said, Oliver using a gun, everybody uses a gun, like, all this violence in this show, and then it's just like, ooh, maybe we need to contain that. You know, that's how you lose viewers, I think, and we just don't need it. Luckily, hopefully, you know, we'll never get that in Flash, but if that does come, you know, you have to hope that that is gonna flow nicely into this, and not as this big mess that all these other shows are doing.
Yeah. I wanted to mention on Supergirl, like, Supergirl is already, like, it's pretty low tier written show as far as these shows go, I would say. So it's already, like, not well written a lot of the time. It's definitely gotten better, but it's definitely it's weak there. And they've also cooled off of the alien immigration stuff, right? Yeah, it's relevant to current events, but, like, again, people don't go to if people wanted to know about current events, they would read about current events, right? They wouldn't go to escapism. I should probably look up studies on this. I would imagine there's been studies done on this, but I'm just going to go ahead and guess. I would say if you surveyed people, probably up to 80% of people would say that when they consume media, it's a form of escapism for them, you know, from reality, from current events, from politics, from whatever. Like, you don't go to your escapism to be reminded of reality, right? And I also think that it's just a very weak form of creating content to have to rely on current events. It's like if you follow a YouTuber, let's say, and they're like, oh, this guy, you know, he talks about whatever, he's interesting stuff. Well, you know, he's like got nothing left in the barrel when every one of his videos is just like, oh, I went and looked at what's trending right now and just gave my opinion on that every time. Now, obviously some YouTubers have that as a style, but if that's not their style, then they're just, like, reaching for something, and they're just like, well, I I just gotta make content about this because I want views. I want the clicks because this is what's trending, this is what's popular. And there's so many that do that too. Like there's so many YouTubers who just go based off of that premise. Like that's all they do is just talk about trending stuff, all the just current events. But if that's all that you have is just to be like, well, here's my generic opinion on this, like it's not going to be interesting. I also wanted to bring up the X-Men, right? Because people will often use the X-Men as an example of like, well, X-Men were actually created as an allegory for being gay or being black or being, being an outcast, being a minority, that whole thing. But the thing is I don't really buy into that narrative completely. I don't think that like that's just all that it was. I think that's actually, I think, if Connor gets in on this call, I think he's got a good opinion on that we should bring up. I want to say he's got something interesting that he had discussed on Marvel Talk at one point. But it's never, my point is it's never been like actually a primary part of the narrative of mutants. And it hasn't been a primary part. Any part of things that are historically like interesting for their narrative, for their commentary on something like that, like being like, well, this was something that was around during the civil rights movement. Therefore it's like it's an interesting commentary on those times. That can only happen if it's a natural like creation, right? It's not going to happen if you're forcing in a narrative, because it's not an actual reflection of the times then. It's just a reflection of what wants to be forced, like what isn't actually there, but what you want to be there. Like an extreme version or just like a hardline position. It's not really like interesting commentary on historical events. Is more like, well, during this period of time, there was an economic, or let's say in the 80s, there was a lot of content just made that was very almost like nihilistic, almost like very extremist, very focused on the end of the world because of where the threat was with the Cold War. So that's an actual reflection of the times. Is like people were always like thinking about like, well, we can die tomorrow. Like that was often embedded in like the heart of what was being created. So that's a real reflection. But if you were just like, well, I'm going to tell a story about how Russia is evil, then like that's not interesting. That's just you blatantly like putting your position out there. And lastly, mutants are fundamentally different. Just I know we're not talking about X-Men, but mutants are fundamentally different than any other minority group, because nobody is like a white person and then at the age of 13 turns into a black person, right? Like then that's one of the interesting things about X-Men is like they're somebody who was normal who gets turned into something else and now has to like accept that change in who they are. If anything, I would argue that like that is more a matter of like when you are a child, you're innocent and you are an apolitical being, and once you reach adulthood, you are essentially forced into holding a position, right? Like you come to a belief in your early 20s, and that pretty much shapes your belief for the most of the rest of your life. And you think that you're right, whether you are or not, and you have to live with that in the world, no matter what the world is like. All right, that's the end of that rant. Do you agree generally with that, or anything?
No,
that
yeah,
you
I totally agree. I mean, it's the same thing right now with AOS, with the Inhumans, right? They're doing the same thing like the X-Men have been doing, because they're pushing so heavy this season on like, oh, Inhumans are bad, right? Like there's a senator who wants to just get rid of Inhumans. Mm-hmm. And it's just the same thing, like the Watchdogs, they're very anti-Inhuman and they're very extremist towards them, right? Like, it's like, oh, you're just freaks, monsters, and all this stuff. And, like, I don't like how those characters handle Inhumans, right? Because it just feels somewhat forced. And then here comes, like, one of the main antagonists, and he's like, I just don't like them because of how they become. He's more of an old school kind of character. He's like, they didn't work for these powers, and that's why I want to get rid of them. It's very simple, easy to understand, not like, oh, here's all these hate groups towards Inhumans, and it's like, well, this kind of does reflect the times, right, guys? And it's like, yeah, sure, but, simplicity is what we need more, and it does kind of go with the plot. But honestly, it's like they could have done a lot better than just be like, well, yeah, they're different than us, so let's just hate on them.
Well, let's look at that too for a second there. So there's a difference between, like, we're going to have a commentary and we're going to focus on the negative or the positive aspects is what you could do, right? Like, so focusing on the so-called hate groups of Inhumans, right, is one way that you could take, like, this emergence of these of these people, of these different types of people, right? Or what I would do is focus on Inhumans coming together and creating communities and brotherhood and training together and becoming a cohesive group. That is way more interesting, in my opinion, than just being like, here's a couple of Inhumans that we have, and we're never going to develop their characters, but look at all these other people who hate them every season. Like, what's more interesting? What's more compelling? What's actually a better narrative to tell? And I think it's obvious that one of these is tainted with, let's just shoehorn in our position, basically. We obviously are not focused on these Inhumans and their development. We're just focused on talking about hate groups. So we're just kind of using Inhumans to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if they did that, it'd be way better than what we have now, and you can even do that with, they could easily do that in Supergirl, right? With that whole immigration thing, if that was going to be more than one episode, right? I mean, sure, they kind of had the little contrast in the episode where, like, well, these aliens are bad, so this is why we need to do this. But that wasn't really defining every character we've had. Right, like, we've had some pretty, like, we had a white Martian show up, right, and he was pretty menacing, and that could be one reason we need to limit this kind of thing. But, like, again, you're not focusing on that. It's like, well, every alien that Supergirl fights is evil, so let's just keep it that way. And it's like, no, why don't we have something different than this, that? And, I did like what Renee was doing on the Arrow episode about the anti-gun. And he was very simple about it. He's just a simple man. He has few beliefs, and that's one of them. And he doesn't need, like, this overcomplicated drama that could go on for minutes, like a good portion of the episode, right? Whereas the other characters and the main plot is all negative, but he's really the only positive on it. And their solution was just like, okay, let's kind of just meet at the middle, guys. And it's like, well, it doesn't feel like you accomplish much by doing that, right? Because it's so heavily focused on the negativity, and it's like, well, we only got one person rooting for the other team, and it's like, okay, so I guess we'll just leave it and just probably never come back to it. It's like, it's not enough, right? Like, you could have made this play out a lot longer than what we had, and that would probably have made it better. And, like, you could have even eased it in last episode, but they decided not to do that. This is just a one-off kind of filler type thing. It's the poor use of their characters and the fact that it's just so random and makes no sense with the show, right? Like how it bothered us when it was like, what? You used to kill people? You were the hood? Like, oh, we can't work with you. Like, that's the same exact feeling I'm getting. It's just like, why are you going to say that after everything the show's been through?
Well, and that's the thing about when you're shoehorning this stuff into, like, it does go, like, they present this so-called, like, problem, right? And then they're just solve it super fast. Like, well, here's the solution, and then we move on and we never talk about it again. Because, like, all they really want to do is just kind of shoehorn this in. They don't actually want to be like, well, let's make a show that actually discusses this. Whereas, like, you could be like, well, Daredevil discusses kind of what's wrong with, corruption, right? So it does a good job of actually, like, making that a focus of the show. But this, like, obviously isn't interested in it. It's just like the writers were like, hey, let's just spend an episode doing this, making this point, and not actually being invested in it. We just want to signal to everyone else, like, hey, we're anti-gun. All right? There you go.
Yeah, I know we haven't mentioned the Netflix shows a lot, but Jessica Jones kind of does that, and Luke Cage does that too, right? Mm-hmm. And they put it into the story well enough to where it doesn't stand out into your face too much, right? Like, you're not sitting there watching it like, man, like, okay, here's the part where I don't really care because it's something that's just a distraction for me, or it's like, those aren't my beliefs, so I shouldn't pay attention to this part, kind of thing. Whereas I'm like, the whole episode, I'm just in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I'm like, this isn't good storytelling, this is just a random thing, yada yada.
Yeah, I mean, like, so Jessica Jones, like, the most we can compare them to this discussion with Jessica Jones would be to play with the old, like, like, I'm a strong woman trope, right? Like Sarah. And they, like, don't really do it that in Jessica Jones. If anything, I would say they play off of that trope with her friend. What's her friend's name again?
Patsy?
Patsy. Yeah? Is it Patsy?
Yeah, Patsy Walker.
Yeah. Well, like, I would say they play off of it with her because, like, she wasn't a strong woman, and then she's like, I am gonna be a strong woman, and, like, makes this a big point about it, and it's like, she overestimates her ability, and like, sees that there's a big gap between, like, what she's capable of and what Jessica's capable of, and that there's differences between them, and like, basically she needs help, or she needs something else to assist her in order to, like, be up to that level. Like, so it just totally plays off of that and doesn't force anything in. And then even the same thing with Luke Cage. Like, Luke Cage never makes a huge point about, like racism or something. Like it's like, yes, it is focused on Black culture, and that, like, clearly almost everybody in the show is Black, and it's in a Black neighborhood and whatever, and that's clear. But they do things kind of correctly. Like, Luke Cage doesn't want more guns and corruption in a Black neighborhood because there's lots of guns and corruption in Black neighborhoods, and that's a problem. And so it deals with it well. Where instead, like, a poorly written show would just be like, oh, look, the white people are just shipping in guns and making things corrupt in the neighborhood. And it's like, okay, like, well, thanks for telling us that. Like, it could have just shoehorned that in, but it didn't at all. It's just like, look, here's Luke Cage. He's this really upstanding guy. There's lots of crummy people in this neighborhood, and Luke Cage is going to be is going to rise above all that and be like an icon, be something that people can aspire to, and I think that's awesome, and that's a way that you really can do. Like, they do a lot of justice to the Black community and to, like, building a neighborhood that represents it, but at the same time acknowledging, like, the actual issues without getting so politicized that they're, like, overstepping or doing something as, like, stupid as just being, like, calling racism or sexism, which is basically what Legends does.
Yeah, exactly. So, hey Connor, what's up, man?
Oh, what's happening, guys? How's life?
Good. Just having a good discussion on like, how these comic book shows basically, when they get too political, right?
Yeah.
And how most of the time they're just one-offs and they never touch on it again. What are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, typically, what I always find is often what the case will be is yeah, like you said, there'll be one-offs, and so it'll focus on, like, this like, oh, cool, edgy, topical issue or whatever for, like, one episode, and it would pretty much invariably have, like, some like white capitalist guy as the villain ultimately, and by the end of the episode, like, somehow they humiliate him and, like, defeat him and whatnot, and that's basically the end of it. But, like, it'll factor into, like, the overall arc of the show in some respect, I guess, but nothing majorly, and ultimately it's just like they just constantly, like, take jabs at what they perceive to be the the status quo, or like the man. When in reality, it's like, well, you're the man, buddy. Like, let's be real. Like you are the status quo.
Connor, I wanted you to talk about, and I could be misremembering, but I thought that you had a perspective on the creation of X-Men that was different than the standard narrative.
Well, like
was it what Jack Kirby said it was initially, like, supposed to be a representation of? Wasn't there something that digresses from the narrative?
God, I don't know. It might not have been me. To be honest, I want to say I kind of know that Stan Lee's intention with the X-Men, of course, is the most common a depiction of the X-Men, where they're like a sort of a stand-in between like the X-Men is Martin Luther King to the Brotherhood of Mutants. I guess like Black nationalism or Malcolm X in specific. Yeah. Malcolm X pre-prison time, like Nation of Islam, Malcolm X. So and that's generally the go-to depiction of the X-Men, but I do kind of vaguely remember that maybe there was maybe it was more like a Darwinist approach to X-Men that wasn't exactly focused on. Well, I know that oftentimes something that people have complained about in regard to X-Men actually is that the X-Men will frequently fight intergalactic threats, and I've seen critics say, oh, that's not interesting. Those aren't interesting comics because it doesn't play to X-Men's strength, and the X-Men comic strength is depicting like the struggle of minorities, basically. Well, see,
so I argue that something that I said earlier in the show here was that though that's the narrative, that like it's supposed to be that they're supposed to essentially represent minorities or the civil rights movement and all of that, is that that is more a fabrication than it ever actually was, and that the best selling and the best, I guess, critically or fan based comics of the X-Men, like When the X-Men is the Best X-Men, it actually has nothing to do with a commentary on like minorities. It's not those stories that are compelling, and the more that it gets to be to that point, as the Marvel Comics is now, is it just alienates people when that's forced to an extreme, yeah, that was kind of the main point there.
Yeah,
would you agree to that?
Yeah, that's true. I definitely I do think that off the top of my head, like the best X-Men I guess like events as they are now, but like the X-Men like series, the arcs happened. Well, for one, they happened like in the 80s and stuff, and they had nothing to do. Like Dark Phoenix Saga doesn't have anything to do with minority rights, you know, like that that has like the least to do with minority issues or whatnot. It's the most interesting. Not just
to that point though, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say not to say that there's no possibility for like there to be some interesting stuff in regard to the X-Men being like minorities of Earth, because I do actually think that like House of M is a great arc, and also that one arc where they have the island or whatever, like that was cool, I think, and that actually used the like minority angle of X-Men to a strength that wasn't just like, oh, we're oppressed, basically. It was really like what happened if the X-Men just established their own nation and was just like, yeah, we're gonna kind of do the Wakanda thing, and we just like made our own country. That's actually interesting and good. It's a shame because ultimately I think the writers had a narrative that was like, no, separation is not good. Like the X-Men shouldn't go on their own. They should integrate into society or whatever. Ultimately, I think that that's a much less interesting narrative, especially when you consider that they could have done really good parallels between the X-Men and Israel. You know, like that actually would have made a lot of sense, especially considering at that time, Magneto was a good guy too. I don't know if Magneto was. I don't remember if Magneto was. Well, Scott was leading the X-Men, but I think Magneto was kind of like an advisor to him, actually.
Yeah.
I kind of have a hard time remembering it. Danny probably knows it way better than me, but yeah, it just would have been interesting. Like Scott and Eric basically set up mutant Israel. That would have been interesting, but ultimately, I think the writers decided, well, because like Phoenix comes back and Scott gets like possessed with the Phoenix Force, and it just kind of like all goes crazy.
Yeah.
And I think that was stupid because they had an opportunity to explore a nation of mutants, and instead it was like, I was like, oh well, everybody likes Phoenix. Like I just said, like Dark Phoenix Saga is a good arc, but like they just mix their two like they mix their two strongest possible narratives together to make like the strength of nothing, basically. So yeah, that was what I was thinking.
The other thing about the X-Men and there being a stand-in for minorities that I'd made a point earlier in the show about was that there's a fundamental difference between mutants and minorities in that nobody is white and then at the age of 13 turns black.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So that doesn't happen. That's a fundamental difference, and so I said that if anything, like for that reason, I would say that it's more akin to like a coming of age story or a sort of like coming to beliefs story. In that like around like the age of your early 20s, you come to establish basically the political and social beliefs that you're going to hold for the rest of your life. And then that's like prior to that point, you're essentially an apolitical existence, like as a kid, as an innocent kid. And then you like in those years, you come to hold certain beliefs and come to understand certain things that you believe to be true, that you believe to be fundamental to your identity. And then you have to then reconcile that with the rest of the world. Which is basically what a mutant has to do. Like this is now essentially like your beliefs are a part of you, mutant powers are a part of you, and it separates you, whether you want it to or not, from other people in society. And then what do you do with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you mentioned the coming of age story concept, okay, can you imagine if they made an arc of X-Men that focused sort of what First Class does in the beginning, really in regard to Charles and Raven. Can you imagine if there was an entire story, like an entire X-Men arc that was an origin story of Charles and Raven's friendship, and it being a coming of age story for the two of them, like coming to their own conclusions. That being, of course, Charles is more like, to go back to the actual civil rights comparison, MLK, Martin Luther King, to Raven's like Malcolm X positions. Can you imagine if that was actually explored and we got to actually see like discourse between the two sides? That was presented in a reasonable way where the audience could go, oh well, I wonder which one was right actually. You know, like if they presented it honestly. However, that's the thing, right? Is it's incredibly difficult for these comic book writers today to present issues honestly and present them without like an overwhelming bias. Like there's constantly an overwhelming bias between these comic book writers and their editors and everything. They all have a bias and they're all trying to get this message across. And it's very hard to have these kinds of like honest discussions between characters anymore. Well, really, I mean, DC was doing that in the 80s really well. I don't know if they get enough credit for that, but they were.
The other thing though with that is it's not necessarily the way in which it's not going to be an issue for someone to have a bias in their writing is that if they're crafting a world that's going to illustrate why that point of view is correct. So I was saying earlier that the Sokovia Accords or vigilantes are things like I would want the Sokovia Accords in real life. I would not want vigilantes in real life. However, the MCU and respectively Daredevil create worlds in which I hold a different position, right?
Yeah.
So
well, if I lived in the world of the MCU, or like more specifically, like especially Daredevil, I would absolutely want vigilantes. But even if it's not the extreme of Daredevil, I would still like the fact that like the concept of Captain America being like this guy that essentially is more so than it's funny, more so than the supposed living document of the Constitution. Like Captain America is like a really like he's an actual living human being from another time, from like a time in America's past that like upholds the values of an older America. And so you can kind of use him to like check yourself to go like, well, because we can't like ask George Washington, obviously, like what he thought. We can't even ask like Theodore Roosevelt what he thought. But we could in the MCU ask Steve Rogers what he thinks about something, and depending on what it is, like you could use him as kind of a guide for certain things. That's actually like really useful and powerful, and for that reason, it's like a vigilante like Steve. Yeah, sure. Like in the world of the MCU, yeah, you kind of need that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they do that really well. Like me and Shelby were saying earlier, it's like it's so integrated into the story that there's no real problem with it, right? And, over in the CW verse, there are times where it's like, do we really need vigilantes? Do we really need the Flash? Right? And for them to try to relate to you, they go for these questionable episodes that we do get, and it gets a negative impact. And right after watching that episode of Arrow, I'm thinking like, oh man, are we going back to like season 4 kind of quality? Right? Mm-hmm. And that's not what I want to think, I mean, like, Connor, what you were saying with the whole X-Men stuff, like, I do wish we would get that more. And just the problem with the shows is just that they either think they don't have enough time, or they just want to have nice big explosions. But in between, they try to give us a break, quote unquote, that ends up just messing us up altogether, kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, speaking of Arrow, like going back to this current season, I guess the spoiler alert for this current season of Arrow, but when Artemis finds out that Oliver used to kill people, her like indignation at that fact is incredibly like unrealistic, and they don't really explore her reasons for it, other than she just is like, well, killing is bad and that makes you a bad guy. And of course I'm over here like, yeah, well, these were like really bad people that Oliver was killing. So it's like, it's not like he was like just going around like killing car thieves and stuff. Like these were like really bad guys.
But they use guns also.
Yeah, that too. Yeah. Like Wild Dog's just running around with guns and stuff. Look, Wild Dog, you're not like a Terminator. Like come on, bro. Like you can't really just like shoot guys in the knees with like perfect accurate stuff. You were thrown out of the Navy, bro. Like I don't buy it. So yeah, like this whole like incredulity at like somebody like Oliver doing what needs to be done. I'm just like, what? No, come on, I don't buy it. But they don't explore it, right? They don't explore either side of the argument. Like they leave it at this very uninteresting. Well, like they could have had. It could have been a good reveal, right? I don't know. I never watched Arrow super religiously, so I don't know if they ever did explore Oliver's morality more. But like, I don't know, like the way that it appears from this like recent season, it's like they didn't really give it much thought at all. They were just like, oh, Oliver used to do bad things. That was bad, but he doesn't do bad things anymore. The end. And I'm like, no, like that's not interesting at all.
Yes, it's very. Thing is, it's very shoehorned in for essentially the sake of signaling, right? I mean, that's what it is. Is like we're not a show about not killing. Obviously, we're not a show that's not. We're not an anti-gun show. We're not about creating worlds. Like there's not been any point in which Arrow has sought to craft a world that guns are not the answer. That's never been a thing, or even killing. Ultimately, like I mean, maybe there has definitely been like points about like Oliver shouldn't kill anymore and all this stuff. But I mean, do they want character development or not? Because he goes through, I'm killing people, and then it's like I'm not going to kill people. I really have to struggle with the fact that I can't kill people, and then ultimately coming to grips with the fact that sometimes you do have to kill people. That was his character arc, and then it's kind of like that was kind of thrown out the window a bit this season, at least at certain points, I guess. It didn't feel that way right off the bat. Like he really felt like he had that experience under his belt initially, and then it's kind of like, oh, he is going to kill people, and then turns out to be a bad decision again, and I don't know, and then it's kind of just popping up here and there now without ever really making an attempt for this to be the world that they were creating, just to shoehorn in, and most likely, like, they're not going to talk about anti-gun stuff again. It was just going to be for this episode.
Oh, so there was a full, like, anti-gun episode now?
Yeah, it was.
Because I'm not caught up. Okay.
It's episode 13, Connor, and that's what pretty much gave me the thing where I'm like, okay, we have to talk about this on an episode, right? Because it's the main focus of the episode. It's so, like, outfield, like, it makes no sense for the plot. And I mean, the best line has to be from Felicity, where she says, like, this kind of stuff is really, really getting us nowhere in the episode, right? When she was talking to some of the characters, I'm thinking, well, yeah, she's right. Like, this is gonna get explored later, and we're just gonna ignore it. Now, if this was a pressing matter for a few episodes on, right, because this episode, like, Oliver as the mayor was actually involved, then that could get interesting. But I doubt that's gonna happen.
Oh, so it's not even like they don't even ask Oliver, or the question isn't posed to him as the mayor to be like, what are you going to do to clean up gun violence? They don't
was, and how the end of the episode was like, okay, well, here's this law that we're going to pass that pretty much gets both sides a good answer. Which, as Danny, you pointed out earlier when we were talking, was, okay, over the past 4 years, like, the city's been attacked by how many people, none of which used guns.
That is funny.
Right? Yeah.
It's almost like they should put like a ban on throwing stars and like bows and stuff. That should be the thing that they ban the most. Yeah, and like the motive for the character this episode who started all this is, sure, it sucks, but it's not really strong enough for his actions. Right, where it's just like, oh yeah, because of this one person where this accident happened, like, it's gonna throw this show into this ultimatum where, like, well, are guns good or bad? Because like, even Oliver points it out, he's like, even if we did have gun control, like, this still would have happened, right? Because those guns that these people were purchased illegally. This is a universe in which a guy put his hand into another guy's chest to kill him. Yes. Let's just remember that. That's a good point. Like, are guns good or bad? What are you talking about? Are hands good or bad? Like, what are you talking about here? Like, and isn't that kind of the thing with, like, the X-Men universe? Like, there's nobody in the X-Men universe who discusses guns, right? Because guns are knives next to mutants, right? And we have metahumans and people who can use, like, the strangest of objects as, like, weapons of mass destruction. Like,
how are guns? How can we really pretend to like guns are an issue? Like in real life, guns are not even the issue. They're not like statistically, like having people who with conceal and carry permits do not increase gun violence. So, like that's not true for our life, and it's certainly not true for this world. Like, I don't know. Like, and honestly, if they were going to do this type of anything regarding guns or like military or anything like that, like should have been done last season when the ghosts were
happening. Yeah.
Yeah, because they were actually a military unit. Like they were actually mercenaries. Like Surge City was occupied by a military force with full combat gear, which I'm sure like parts of that are probably already illegal, right? But like that clearly didn't stop them when they occupied your freaking city. So I don't know. Maybe your issue is like your corrupt politicians. Maybe your issue is lack of good law enforcement. I don't know. Maybe you're looking in the wrong place, I think.
Yeah, because definitely this would have been better on The Flash, right? With metahumans, like you were saying. Like, they brought that up in season 1, right? When Eddie was framed for shooting those 2 cops and it was a metahuman who could shapeshift. And, you know, the only thing we ever got was the higher up telling Joe, like, I don't know if we can handle something like this. Right? And then it's nothing too imposing or underwhelmed, right? They just like kind of bring that up and then they just brush it to the side because it's like, well, it's only in Central City. But say like this season, right? I think would have been the best chance to do that because of all these metahuman husks and then just everything like that. And especially the random negativity towards Kid Flash this season.
Right.
It could have definitely been discussed in at least a 2-parter, right? And I think they could have handled that smoothly and more story driven than what Supergirl, Legends, and Arrow have been doing already.
And you know, that's the other thing. If it's like, okay, well, why aren't we having a talk about outlawing metahumans outright, or either you know, in the case of someone like the Flash, essentially like it nationalizing them. Was that the right word to use? To make them an agent of the state, right? Like, why isn't the Flash an agent of the state?
Yeah, like the Superhuman Registration Act. Yeah, for like DC, that would be awesome. Actually, I would love that discussion on that.
But it'll never happen because that's the thing. Like, they could go, "Hey, guns are bad. Hey, metahumans are bad. Let's outlaw all of this stuff and just like put a ban on."
Play with the implications therein, right? Like if you make the implication, oh, metahumans are bad, therefore they're outlawed. You're making a huge implication for like the social climate of the current time. Similarly, if you make if you make the statement like, oh, guns are bad, they should be outlawed, you're making a huge statement on the political climate of our time.
Which is to say, like, so yeah, what they would actually do is, like, if they were even going to bring up the topic of, hey, maybe we should ban metahumans, maybe like they've killed a lot of people and we can literally do nothing, then like the way they would do it, rather than actually ban them and then make the Flash and Kid Flash agents of the state, as it like would be a way to do this, then you know what they would give us instead is like, hey, we should probably ban them because blah blah blah, and then they would go, well, hey, not all metahumans are bad, and then they would just say like, hey, you can't really discriminate against metahumans, even though all of them except for these 2 guys have just killed people. That's what the story the CW would give us is the thing. Like that, the moral of the story would be like, well,
the moral of the story would be max salt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's the thing about, like, I mean, in Supergirl, that was the story, right? Like, they were like, there's all these aliens, we don't know what the hell is going on, we don't know what they're capable of, but Supergirl's really nice, so I guess we should just let them all be citizens of Earth, because that's what they did in that show. They gave them all, like, automatic citizenship, rather than being like, well, we can at least, like, screen you to know what kind of, like, abilities you have at the very least, like we know what we're dealing with, on a purely like like concern for like the health and safety of other people. Like I don't know what kind of spores come from your gills or whatever. Like I don't know. They weren't even concerned with anything like that, let alone like being like, well, are you dangerous, or let's give you a psyche value, anything, or even the fact that like why should you get citizenship here? Like you can visit, I guess.
The moral imperative trumped like reason, right? Like it was a moral imperative, therefore we had to do it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, rather than deal with like interesting implications of what if we did this, that's here's a good way to do it. Like you go, let's ban all metahumans, and then the Flash can't help anyone, and then they see, well, we need the Flash's help. So how do we do this? How do we ban all of these things? But we don't exactly want to ban them. We just want to be like, hey, these things are not acceptable. You can't use powers out in public unless it's under like state sanctioned activity, like the Flash would be, right? And obviously, like that's not to say that like we should get the Sokovia Accords happening, because the Sokovia Accords, again, like I would probably support like a more lax version of the Sokovia Accords actually in the MCU. It's just the Sokovia Accords are like ridiculously restraining on the heroes, right? Like,
well, ultimately they required like a huge like majority hearing in like the UN and stuff. It was like overboard, where it was like, dude, by the time you guys come to a decision, like the whole world's gonna be exploding by now. So like, what's the point? Like, yeah. That being said, like, I mean, if I do think to an extent, like if a superhero team is going to operate in a country, that nation gets the right to say like, well, I don't know, like maybe we get to say something, but I don't know about the entire UN. Like the fact that it essentially was just like a way of like bureaucratizing the Avengers, and I would never be in support of that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, overall, to get an end note for this episode, basically, is it has to be handled carefully when you're dealing something with this, right? Where you want to lean left, right, wherever, or you have certain agendas you want to point out in the show. Just really make it so that way it flows into this overarching plot and makes sense for the characters that you're doing it with, and pretty much make it so that way your audience isn't too negative, but like try to make it even, right? Have some negative, some positive, kind of balance it out, right? And I think that would be the best way to do this. Now, are they going to do that? Probably not. I mean, Flash is, I guess, the best way to do it, right?
At this point, yeah.
Yeah, because I think their team can handle it. You know, we've had a few things like that before, and it was all right. So, until they can get it right, like, I don't think we need any more of this politicalness in our superhero shows where none of these things really matter to them.
Agreed.
Yeah, I'm definitely into that. I suspect actually that we might be seeing less politicization in media like this, actually, because I don't know if you guys had read, but I think it was Greg Berlanti himself, right, who's writing a run of X-Men at the moment, who said that he was going to focus on less on the current like socio-political climate, just because it's so divisive, that he was like, no, well, I would rather make something that was like more escapist than dealing with like the heaviness of reality. Me, of course, I like actually dealing with issues and stuff. I wouldn't necessarily say I like the way that modern comics and media and overall deal with the issues, but I still like the topics being discussed, I guess. So I'm not 100% like on board with this concept of like, oh, well, we'll just make escapist fantasy so nobody has to worry about these things. I'm not necessarily on board with that, but I suppose.
Well, okay, so flat out escapism is one thing. Making an apolitical story is another thing, and making a story that illustrates a point of view or illustrates a world in which like it sets up so that a policy or a position is clearly like brings you to believe that position, right? Like these are all different things that are all very interesting. What's not interesting is to say like, hey, you like X-Men, right? Well, Wolverine says that you should do this, and there you go. Like, and that's what's been done. It's also different to just do clickbait, to be like, well, what is the most interesting? So Muslims, that's the biggest, one of the most highly discussed minority groups currently. So let's make our story about Muslims. Like that's a very clickbaity thing to do, and that's not an interesting thing to do. And I think it. Like I can safely say that that's not something that you mean to say you're interested in at all.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
So I don't know. Maybe we won't necessarily be getting these kinds of stories anymore. Or there might be like a turning of the tide. I mean, I guess we'll just have to see.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it hasn't worked out well for the comic book industry. Didn't work out well for the video game industry. It's not going to work out well for the shows mimicking the behavior of shoehorning in this sort of like clickbaity current events. We only care about it for one episode and not actually throughout the story type of behavior. Like, it's not going to stick, and like it's one for one reason or another, it's going to fall by the wayside. As far as comic book industry goes, I think they're going to have to move on to a different strategy to attempt to acquire new demographics or new viewers within their actual demographic that they've had for almost a century.
Yes. And to have the best example out there of how not to do this, right? Law and Order SVU episode on Gamergate.
The Gamergate episode, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that the worst way or the best way? I'm kind of undecided on that one.
Farming it for memes is pretty different than taking it seriously, though.
Well, okay, good point. Yeah.
I mean, remember there was that first person angle shot.
Dude, that was the best first person shot since like The Rock and Doom. That was crazy.
Yeah, so many good memes from that.
So yeah, overall, I think this was a pretty good episode. Thank you, Marvel Talk, for joining us. And if we want to hear more from you, where can we find you guys?
You can find me at VegetaX6 on Instagram.
You can find me at MuleNewsMight everywhere.
And of course, we will always have the social media links in the description. And thank you again for listening. You can email us at unversedpodcast@gmail.com for questions, comments, concerns. And as always,
potentially hate mail.
Hate mail. Like if you have some thoughts on what we have, some disagreements or anything, send us an email, and we'll do a part 2.
Definitely.
And talk about it. So as always, guys, we will talk to you next time. Hey everybody, thanks for listening again to this episode. If you want to hear more, go to Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, or SoundCloud, where we have the latest episodes. And of course, we always have them at unversedpodcast.libsyn.com. And if you want to listen to Marvel Talk, they are also on Stitcher, iTunes, and SoundCloud at Marvel Talkcast. And if you want to follow us on social media, remember, we're always at Unversed Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm also on those sites at Negator7. And if you want to follow Marvel Talk, they're there too at Marvel Talkcast. Shelby is mainly on Instagram at VegetaX6. And Connor is Mjolnir's Might on Instagram. And if you ever want to check out more content, YouTube, I'm at Negator7. I have, the edits. Not a lot going on right now, but I'm going to be posting stuff here and there whenever I have from projects working on. Marvel Talk is also on YouTube. They're starting to grow like we are, throwing their episodes up, so that's going to be Marvel Talk on YouTube. And of course, we have House of Cerberus, which holds the archives for the streams over at House of Cerberus on Twitch. And of course, I'm there too at Negator7, and our boy Jerry at Jerry Omega, if you guys want to follow us when we stream. And that's all we got. Thanks again, everybody, and we will talk to you next time.